Officer Craig Landry's furious voice echoed through the courthouse corridor as he dragged Nora Grant toward a small hearing room. "Interfering with a police investigation," he snarled, rattling off one trumped-up charge after another. A cluster of onlookers stared in disbelief, some whispering that the officer had finally gone too far. Nora, her thin wrists uncomfortably pinned, locked eyes with the crowd. Despite her predicament, there was an unshakable resolve in her gaze, a silent promise that she would not be broken by yet another display of unwarranted power. The tension crackled like a live wire, as though the walls themselves sensed that an explosive truth was about to be laid bare. No one, not even Officer Landry, realized just how epic this showdown would become. Earlier that day, Nora Grant had been making her way toward the courthouse on a blistering summer afternoon, the sun beating down relentlessly. She walked with the careful determination of someone accustomed to the weight of years and responsibilities. Her cane clicked softly against the pavement as she approached, her steps steady despite the heat. She had just finished delivering a casserole to an ailing neighbor and was carrying an empty dish in her weathered hands when she heard a distressed voice near the parking lot behind a small hardware store. An elderly man stood there, his expression panicked as he patted his pockets and looked under nearby cars. "I can't find it," he muttered, his voice trembling with frustration. He glanced around, helpless and flustered. Nora stepped closer, her instincts kicking in. "What have you lost?" "Sir," she asked gently. "My wallet," he replied, shaking his head. "I had it just a moment ago, but now it's gone." Nora took one look at his trembling hands and decided she had to help. She leaned down, scanning the ground carefully. After a moment, she spotted a scuffed leather wallet peeking out from under a discarded soda cup. She picked it up and handed it to the man, whose relief was immediate. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You're a blessing." Nora smiled softly. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied, though she knew deep down that wasn't entirely true. Her late husband, Samuel, had always told her that small acts of kindness were the glue holding society together. It was a philosophy she'd carried with her for decades. With that small deed behind her, Nora resumed her walk to the courthouse. The building loomed ahead, its towering columns and wide stone steps stark against the cloudless sky. It was supposed to symbolize justice, yet Nora couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The older she got, the more she realized that justice often felt like an uphill climb, especially for people like her. At 72, Nora had lived through more than her fair share of hardships, and those experiences had forged her quiet strength. As she climbed the courthouse steps, Nora noticed a commotion near the entrance. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer with a square jaw and a nameplate that read Landry was looming over a teenage girl. The girl, no older than 16, clutched her school backpack tightly and avoided Landry's accusing glare. "Loitering," Landry barked. "This is public property, not your playground." The girl stammered a weak reply, her voice barely audible. Nora's steps faltered. She recognized the fear in the teenager's posture, the way her shoulders hunched as though bracing for an inevitable blow. Something about the scene churned in Nora's stomach. She adjusted her grip on her cane and stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Landry turned sharply, his eyes narrowing at the interruption. "Stay out of it." "Ma'am," he snapped, "this doesn't concern you." Nora's gaze didn't waver. "She's not doing anything wrong. This is a public building. She has every right to be here." Landry's lips curled into a sneer. "You people," he muttered, "always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Nora felt a slow burn in her chest. She'd heard those words before, spoken with the same disdain. Still, she kept her composure. "She's just a child," Nora said evenly. "Let her go." Landry's grip on the girl's backpack slackened for just a moment, and the teenager took her chance, darting away into the crowd of onlookers that had gathered nearby. Furious, Landry turned back to Nora, his face red with anger. "You want to interfere? Fine," he growled, seizing Nora's arm in a vice-like grip. "You can explain yourself inside." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few people protested, but no one stepped forward to stop him. Nora's heart thundered in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I have nothing to hide," she said quietly. Landry dragged her through the courthouse doors, his boots echoing on the marble floors. The air inside was cooler, but the stares of curious onlookers made it no less oppressive. A few recognized Landry and muttered among themselves. His reputation preceded him, it seemed. Nora was ushered into a small hearing room. The space wasn't crowded, but the few people present formed a tense, expectant audience. Landry wasted no time listing his accusations: obstruction, disturbing the peace, even an absurd claim of resisting arrest. Each charge was more preposterous than the last, but Nora remained composed, her expression unreadable. The court clerk, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, glanced at Nora sympathetically as she recorded the officer's tirade. Meanwhile, Landry puffed himself up, clearly relishing his performance. His words dripped with condescension, and Nora could see the satisfaction he took in asserting his authority. Judge Emerson entered the room, his robe swishing softly as he took his seat at the bench. An older man with a sharp mind and a discerning gaze. He peered down at Landry and Nora with a faint frown. "Officer Landry," the judge began, his tone measured, "please explain how Mrs. Grant posed a threat." Landry launched into an exaggerated account, painting Nora as an aggressive instigator who had hindered his ability to perform his duties. His tale was so outlandish that Nora almost laughed, but she kept her expression neutral. Instead, she let her eyes wander to the faces of the spectators. Some were outraged, others skeptical but silent. Then, unexpectedly, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A court officer stepped inside carrying a slim folder and looking flustered. He approached the bench and whispered something to Judge Emerson. The judge's frown deepened, and he tapped his gavel lightly. "We will take a brief recess," he announced. "The court will reconvene in 15 minutes. Whispers filled the room as people speculated about what new information had surfaced. Nora remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Landry paced near the prosecution's table, his confidence undiminished. When the hearing resumed, the tension in the room was palpable. Judge Emerson regarded Landry with a cool expression before turning his attention to Nora. "Mrs. Grant," the judge said, "you may speak." Nora straightened in her seat, her voice steady but resolute. "Your Honor, there's been a misunderstanding," she began. "I intervened to protect a young girl from undue harassment, not to obstruct justice. I've spent my life upholding the law, not breaking it." As she spoke, Nora reached into her bag and retrieved a small leather case. She opened it to reveal a badge. A collective gasp rippled through the room. "I am a retired federal investigator," she said, her voice firm. "My career was dedicated to protecting the rights of vulnerable people and ensuring that justice was served. That girl did nothing wrong." Officer Landry's actions were not only unprofessional, but also deeply troubling. Landry's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth to protest but found no words. Judge Emerson's expression darkened as he reviewed the documents in the folder the court officer had delivered. "Officer Landry," the judge said, his voice heavy with authority, "your behavior raises serious concerns. This court will not tolerate the abuse of power, especially not in this building where justice must be upheld above all else. I am ordering an immediate review of your conduct. Mrs. Grant, all charges against you are dismissed, with the court's apologies." The room erupted into quiet applause. Landry's shoulders slumped, his bravado evaporating as the gravity of the situation sank in. He was escorted from the room by a bailiff, his defeat unmistakable. Outside the courthouse, Nora descended the stone steps with quiet dignity. A few people approached her, offering words of gratitude and admiration. The teenage girl she defended stood at a distance, her eyes wide with awe. Nora gave her a small nod, a silent reassurance that kindness and courage still mattered. The sun was just as hot as it had been earlier, but the air felt lighter now, as though the oppressive weight of injustice had been lifted, even if only for a moment. Nora tightened her grip on her cane and continued down the sidewalk, her resolve burning brighter than ever. This battle was won. But there were always more ahead, and she was ready for them.